All right, I'm probably going to mute myself.
And so we are now live, or at least people can come in, and I don't know why it switched to thank you. And let's see if people come in. Yeah, here we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We will be starting shortly. Thank you so much for joining us. We will be starting right around 2 o'clock, but thanks for coming in and spending your Tuesday afternoon, morning, whatever time it is for you with us. Okay, so we are at 2 o'clock. Hopefully more folks will be trickling in, but we're going to get started. And as I said, this is also going to be recorded. So if you have folks who signed up as groups especially, but could not make it, you will be getting a recording of this. So you will be able to watch it at a later date. And in 6 months, we will be putting this on our YouTube channel. So feel free to share far and wide with friends and colleagues, etc. So thanks so much for coming to our continuing education webinar. I'm really, really, really excited about today's. This is being put on by NASIG, which is, and there are specifically our continuing education webinar, continuing education committee. This is part of our webinar series. So thank you all so much for coming. The format for the day is that we have 3 awesome panelists who will be doing this, as I said, I think a really, really important talk about security and what it means for all of us. And then we will also have a you can see you have a little Q&A section on your Zoom. If you click on that Q&A, you will be able to ask a question, and our panelists will be able to look at that question and answer it as it comes through. You can also, I believe you can chat as well. So feel free to, if you wish to chat on Zoom, do so. But if you do have a specific question you want the panelists to answer, I do ask if you put it in the Q&A just so it's easier for us to keep track of that. Panelists will be doing our presentation, and then we will be leaving time at the end for a question and answer as well. So that is kind of how everything is going to run and all the business stuff. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and let you guys all can go on with the program.
All right, thank you, Cheryl. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Our presentation is titled, "The Future Can Be Hacked, How Libraries Can Manage, Operate, and Survive During a Ransomware Attack." My name is Jennifer Arnold, and I'm the Director of Library Services here at Central Piedmont Community College in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I'm joined today by 2 of my colleagues, Cheryl Coyle, who's our Senior Librarian at our Levine Campus Library, and Emily Leachman, who's our Senior Librarian for Public Services here at our Central Campus Library. We're glad you could be here with us today. So our presentation is going to cover a number of topics related to the February 2021 ransomware attack that the college suffered. We're going to talk a little bit, provide an overview about what happened, how that impacted the library, what we wished we would have known, and how you can prepare for such an event, and then sort of our best advice for how to get through the type of disruptive event that a ransomware attack is. Institutions of higher education have increasingly become the victim of ransomware attacks, and we're definitely not the first, nor will we be the last institution to suffer such an event as this. So we'll talk about some of the issues that have come up and that we've addressed and dealt with, and we hope that you'll learn something from our experience that you might be able to apply at your own institutions.
Okay, so what happened? Wednesday, February 10th, 2021 was a normal work day, well, as normal as it could be for being in the middle of the pandemic. So we all finished working from home that day for the most part. And Thursday morning at 5:30 a.m., we got a critical alert that the college was going to be closed due to system-wide interruptions, including emails. Okay, so most of us are thinking, oh, something went awry in the technology building, and we've probably lost a main server, or they've lost power or something. Great. 7:44 p.m., the college will remain closed Friday, February 12th. Please refer to the college website for further details. Okay, I could see us being closed for a day for technology issues, but closing the college Thursday and Friday seems a bit excessive. So now we're all starting to think it's a little more than just a server going down, but not really sure what it was. 12:45 on Friday, we got a critical alert that weekend classes were canceled unless instructors notified their students otherwise. Okay, now we know it's something else, but we don't know what. At 2:06, the news broke that CPCC blames ransomware attack for shutdown, says no signs of personal data at risk. And at 3:04, we all received a critical alert that Central Piedmont had experienced a ransomware attack, and the investigation is ongoing. Please visit this link for further details. That page remained up until just recently, I believe. So on Monday, February 22nd, some classes resumed, the non-technology based classes that were being taught face-to-face. And then Monday, March 1st, all classes resumed, but in Brightspace, and this will be important in a moment. And on Saturday, March 6th, they were able to start accepting online payments for classes. So what was really impacted? Our LMS Blackboard. We were running an internally supported version, was 100% data loss of our LMS. Brightspace, we were already using in a pilot phase. So we had all of our faculty switch to Brightspace, but they lost everything that was in Blackboard. Email, calendar, everything that was in Outlook. We lost all but 1 month prior's emails. We quickly switched to Gmail and the Google suite of products, which was being used by our students. Phones, voicemail, lost all access. Phones were back up February 22nd. SpringShare suite, we used their whole suite of products or most of their suite of products. There was no loss, no interruptions in service, no actions were needed because it was hosted externally. Our student data loads to Sierra, 100% of our process lost. So it wasn't until August 2nd that we were finally able to load student data back into Sierra. Printing on campus, 100% complete program loss. The vendor, in fact, we had contracted with through ITS had to rebuild the entire printing software. By the summer, network printing was back, but with no fees. Time off requests for staff, 100% data loss. We quickly switched to LibStaffer as we were already using the product for desk and chat shift scheduling. Guest access, For our computers, 100% program loss. It was an in-house software that was rendered completely unoperational. Database access, initial was 100% loss. We had to work with vendors for alternative solutions.
So communication is one of the themes that we're going to touch on at several points throughout our presentation. But the first piece we want to cover is how the event affected our most commonly used communication channels. So as a result of the attack, no one had access to their college email. Like you couldn't even access your existing email box, much less send or receive an email. All college telephones were completely inoperable, so you couldn't pick up a phone and call a colleague to ask a question. WebEx is the college's web conference and instant messaging software. So if you're not familiar with it, it's like Slack or Microsoft Teams, if that's one that you've used or heard of. So if staff members were remain logged in to Slack when they ended their, or remain logged into WebEx at the end of their workday on February 10th, they still had access to it. If, however, at the end of their workday, they had logged out, they had no access whatsoever to WebEx. So we had 13 of 44 staff members who had no access to WebEx, no access to email, no access to their telephones in that immediate aftermath of the attack. So this meant that the only remaining method of communication for a significant percentage of our library staff was personal cell phones. So what I ended up doing to help keep those staff members in the loop was basically creating a group text chat for those staff. And whatever information I would send out to library staff who still had access to WebEx, I would then copy that over and send out that same information to that group text. That group text was really essential in keeping those staff members who expressed that they felt isolated, and truly were. They had no way of communicating with anybody or getting information from work other than via their cell phones, from feeling just entirely disconnected. We'll talk more about managing alternative means of communication a little bit further on in the presentation as well.
So as Cheryl mentioned earlier, CPCC libraries, Central Piedmont libraries were already using a lot of SpringShare products. We just naturally have been using them for years. There were a lot that we kind of leaned on even harder in the pandemic, specifically LibChat. And the fact that we didn't lose access to this was basically a lifeline, because students, their email was Gmail. Not all students lost their email access, but all of their faculty did. So they may have been sending emails to their instructors saying, you know, what's going on? What about this assignment? What about this? And not getting an answer because their instructor couldn't get those emails. So the fact that we didn't lose access to SpringShare, specifically LibChat, was really a lifeline for our students, because it was the one place that you could go and there was an actual live human being who worked for Central Piedmont who could answer their questions as to what was going on and what to do. And so for a lot of the time, this was really the only method of live communication for students. In terms of SpringShare access, most of our staff will be coming in a minute and I'll kind of explain some things, but there were a few staff who very briefly didn't have access to SpringShare because of the way they logged in. There was kind of two different ways to log in, but it's something that in-house we could fix. So we had that fixed within not even a day, so that we all had access to things. There's some information on the slide here just in terms of how many chats we were averaging a day kind of pre-attack. Now keep in mind, January 11th is there because that was the first day of our spring semester. February 10th, of course, the last day of normalcy before the attack happened. That's the beginning of the semester for us. So 9 chats a day. You know, things would have ramped up a little bit anyway as we were starting to get into the semester. But then February 22nd, which is Cheryl mentioned earlier on that timeline, was the first day that there was classes in any kind of format. Things really kind of jumped. And then March 1st, which was the first day that any class in Brightspace was there. There were a few small number of classes that have been piloting Brightspace, but basically instructors had 2 weeks to move everything from Blackboard to Brightspace. They were learning it fresh. There was a lot of student questions. How do I get into it? where's my stuff? I can't find my class. I can't find my assignment. There was a lot of that. We were the one place for a live person. So we answered a lot of questions there. We also use LibGuides quite a bit. Through the college. We do have a college website on the college's page. Getting changes to that website is not an easy, smooth process. We have to go through several hoops at the college level to change things. LibGuides let us kind of circumvent that in a way, in that we can have, of course, on the website would be the link to the LibGuide, but then we can keep information that we can update pretty much at the drop of a hat whenever we need to have updated information, like a guide that specifically walks you through Brightspace when it's brand new to you and you've never used it before. So LibGuides kind of let us put together robust information that was accessible to students, that we didn't have to go through all the hoops that we have to first up on our main website. It's still linked to the website. Students can still get there. They don't necessarily realize they're on a LibGuide and not still on the college website, but that is kind of a way that we could update information as it changed, because as you might imagine, in this time frame here, things changed quite rapidly, and an answer to one thing might be different on a different day. I had mentioned that some staff did briefly lose their ability to log into SpringShare. The way SpringShare works is you can log in with your official college login, or you can use your separate SpringShare account. So the left side of this is exactly what the login screen looks like. I took the screenshot, I think, in September, and it's been this more or less the same since we've been using that product. I always log on the left-hand side, so I always use my SpringShare specific account. That I didn't lose access at all. Mine never went down because that's how I was used to logging in. That's what I was used to doing. I entered it every time. It wasn't a problem. There were some staff that only used that right-hand side with the CPCC login, which is of course, our staff ID. That part was down completely. Anything you logged into, and if you had to log into it and it was official through the college, you didn't have access. Staff that were used to doing that and maybe didn't remember what their SpringShare only password was, we did have to reset that, but that was something that our main contact, so Central Piedmont Library employee, who's the main kind of SpringShare person, they were able to reset that on the back end. We could pretty quickly take account of, okay, who doesn't have access? They were able to do a reset. We didn't even have to contact anyone at SpringShare. It was all done with our staff. So we were pretty quickly, even those people who were used to using their college login to get in, we were able to reset their SpringShare password. They were in and ready to go and able to do everything on the back end. The two most important, as I mentioned, being access to LibGuides to update for students, and then that chat, which was a live chat that did kind of explode during this time. In terms of database access, so we are in North Carolina, and as a library in North Carolina, we have access to the statewide consortium of NC Live. So a lot of our resources we get through NC Live. Now, most students are used to using single sign-on, which is their college ID and password. And of course, most of the time that's just fine. During this time, that just flat out wasn't working. So that was one of the biggest hurdles. We were able pretty quickly, NC Live does keep a generic password. We don't use it very much. By we, I mean Central Piedmont, because we are using single sign-on the majority of the time. Some public libraries do use that generic password, but there always is one. So it was just kind of a matter of making sure all of our staff knew what it was. It changes periodically, but making sure all of our staff knew what the current one was, and then getting it to students. Now we can't, there's rules in terms, because of access and contracts with databases, we can't just post it everywhere. But when a student came to chat and said, hey, I'm trying to get into this NC Live resource, or they would name the resource and we would know it was NC Live. We were able to say, oh, use this password, and we knew they were set. So that took care of a pretty significant portion of our passwords. And that was one of the benefits of being part of this statewide consortium, is that they already had the workaround is just always in place. So So that was relatively smooth. The tricky part really just being getting that password to students. So a lot of those chats that we were getting were students who knew how to use our resources, were used to using them, just couldn't get in the way they were used to and needed to know. And as soon as they got the password, they were off and running and didn't need us. In terms of those other resources that we have, in addition to NC Live resources, I talked a lot with our online services librarian kind of after the fact, and what his recommendation is a little bit different than the way we actually did it. So what he was essentially told was, well, get access to all of our resources that aren't NC Live and try to get a workaround. And quite frankly, that's a lot. And that's just, there were a lot of them. That wasn't really possible. So his advice is, if hopefully this will never happen to you, but if it were to, start with the resources that you know are going to be used by your users. Contact them, start to work around. The others can kind of come in as you get requests. That was one of the benefits, is because we were staffing chat and we saw what people were asking for, we kind of knew, and we were able to then say, okay, have we reached out to them? Is there something in place already? Are we in process? Do we need to start a process for that resource? It is probably worth mentioning that not all online resources are set up for password access. Some are really only set up for single sign-on. So that was a stumbling block. We do have some resources that aren't necessarily meant as a library specific resource. We use them that way, but for example, some of the welding databases aren't, like, as a community college with the welding program, it makes sense for us to have access. The majority of the people using it are actually in the field. So there are some that just kind of, we are the anomaly, and so they're not set up for that. The silver lining, though, as I mentioned, is we did find out what people were using. One of the things the online services librarian told me was they were surprised that the very first thing that they were asked about was Oxford music, which was not what they were expecting to be the first faculty to reach out to them to say, where are resources. So that was really nice, is to kind of get a live look at what were students using. I can remember being on chat one day and getting 2 questions for the same resource, and I actually messaged at the time because I had a question, and they wrote back, "Oh, I'm so glad to know that students are using that." So that was kind of a silver lining, is that because people had to go through us for access, we really did get an accurate real-time look at exactly what people were using. And some of that wouldn't have been, I don't think any of us would have said Oxford music was the first thing that people would have asked for. So that was kind of a nice, if you have to look for a silver lining, it was not a bad one. In terms of other considerations, one of the things we recommend is keeping an offline list of contacts for your vendors. What we, as was mentioned, we completely lost access to our email. So if you were used to a contact that you had in email, an email address that you have, and that's the only way you can get to it, we didn't have that anymore. And unless it was someone you had talked to in the last 30 days, we never got it back, ever. So, and we're not going to. So if you can keep an offline list of contacts. Without it, now it wasn't that we had no contact, but we did kind of have to rely on the standard channels of customer service support, which meant that we weren't necessarily going to the person at the vendor who was used to working with us. We weren't necessarily going to our rep, to our troubleshooter, to the people who knew us and our account and our needs. And sometimes the standard levels of customer support were highly successful, and sometimes they were less so. So we didn't have options if we didn't have a contact for the person that we were used to dealing with. So that's important. As Jennifer said, one of the biggest themes you're going to see is communication is key. There was a lot of kind of letting people know what was going on. We did make changes to the website. I did mention that it was difficult to do things, but we would kind of try to let people know what was going on as much as possible. Let students know what databases they could still get access to. Faculty knew that when there were issues with databases that they could reach out to us, mostly via chat, and tell us what they needed, and we would work to get that for them. We would also let faculty know when we were getting information about specific things, assignments and problems with resources. There's a few faculty who do an assignment using the Oxford English Dictionary, which the whole point of the assignment is learning to use the OED. You can't just substitute another resource. It's the whole reason they do the assignment. That was one that we had trouble reaching our vendor rep. And so we didn't have a workaround right away. And I had a chat shift where I had several students kind of in a panic because their assignment was due that Friday and they couldn't get to the resource. And we knew they couldn't get to the resource. So in addition to that, meaning that we again reached out to the vendor to say, hey, we've got students who are trying to use this. Can you please help us come up with a workaround, which we did eventually get. We also reached out to the faculty that we knew were teaching the sections of that course and saying, hey, look, we've got students who were asking about this. So clearly they still have the assignment or they still think they have the assignment. We don't have a way to get to this database right now. It's not that we don't have it. That's something we lost. Can you consider either changing that due date or changing that assignment? So we were able to go straight to them and say, this is kind of what's going on. So good communication in general as to what we could do, what we couldn't do, what we were trying to do, but didn't actually have in place yet, like contacting vendors for workarounds. That became really key.
So a few things we learned about protecting our files. A lot of these we know, but we get a little lazy in our habits and we just start saving things to our desktop. And again, but please never, ever, 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 ever save to your desktop. That is never backed up. Don't even save to a local hard drive at work. If you can, everything should be saved to a network or a cloud drive that your IT department is backing up. So that way, if stuff goes down, you don't lose any of that local information. Instead of saving a file to your desktop, save it on the cloud or your network drive and put the shortcut on your desktop. That way you can if it's something you need access to a lot and you want quick access, do that. There are other solutions. The other thing we learned is save to a cloud drive. Google Drive, Microsoft OneDrive. Those of us we had been fortunate that in the library, we had already been using the cloud drives of Google quite extensively. And so a lot of our files, we didn't lose. We lost maybe a week's worth of access to them, but once they got that back up and running, we had access to all of our files again. So that made it really beneficial. But to have it on that cloud drive, and if you'd shared it with, let's say, your personal Gmail account, you could still kind of get in that back door. So that was good. Another thing is to sync your browser. Saves all your bookmarks. You can sign into it from anywhere. And a lot of us were already using this, especially with the pandemic, but it made it really essential when we lost everything. That if it was in your email and you were used to going to your email and clicking on something to get to a website, you couldn't do that anymore. If it was a bookmark in your browser, and at least that way, when you signed back into your browser, all your bookmarks were there. And one of the things that happened is USB drives were no longer allowed on campus. Many faculty back up their files to a USB drive. Many students would still use them. They don't quite use a cloud drive yet, or our older students don't quite trust cloud drives. They kind of like their files on a device they can have in their hand. Well, since that's where they tracked one of the sources, I believe, to the attack to, they said it made us too vulnerable and no USB drives were allowed on campus from then on.
So as we noted a couple of times, communication is a really important consideration in how you're going to prepare and deal with such an event as this. So as I mentioned before, you can expect that your normal methods of communication are not going to be available to you for a significant amount of time. So from February 10th to February 20th, we had no access to email, no access to our telephones, and almost a third of our staff had no access to any form of college communication channel at all. So one of the things that one of our pieces of best advice is that you need to collect and maintain alternative contact information, both phone and email for your staff. Be as diligent as you can about updating it regularly, like set a calendar, whether it's every 6 months, it's every whatever, to remind yourself to update that information and keep it somewhere that is accessible to you in an emergency situation. I mean, this is one of those things where printing out a list and keeping it somewhere other than your office can be a really good thing. Along the same lines, you want to think now about establishing standard phone and text trees for communication purposes. So for example, in that first weekend where we were kind of closed Thursday and Friday, and then we got messages through the weekend, that Sunday night, as administrators, we got an update that the college would be sort of reopening. Everyone would sort of be back to work as best we could on that Monday. So that Sunday night, I was able to text supervisors and then have supervisors text their staff to be, to understand that they needed to, report to work remotely on Monday and to be looking for information about, how that was all going to work. I also want to emphasize how important having access to and using an IM software like WebEx and really creating a culture of using it can be really helpful in this type of situation. Though it's meant for instant messaging, it can function as your alternative to email in emergency. You're going to want to think about how you format or thread longer messages in these types of programs, but it does give you the ability to get messages to a large group at one time. My last and probably most important piece of advice is to start now. Don't wait for an emergency. So for example, I have been regularly sending out a weekly information email to all staff every Wednesday for like more than a decade. And that had actually increased during the pandemic because as we started work from home, there was just a flood of information and how it was all going to work. And this was all very new to people. So in fact, very early on, I was sending out daily informational updates when there were just a lot of unknowns about how we were going to operate. And, then that kind of calmed down as we all kind of got used to the new normal of the pandemic, but I'm still actually sending out multiple updates per week. But the point here is that having an already established, regular, consistent communication from library administration about important library and college decisions, built sort of an expectation around communication and a base layer of trust that communication is a priority and that it would be forthcoming when staff needed information. These kind of events are very disruptive and they can cause a lot of stress, and good communication can be a part of easing at least some of that disruption and stress. So next I wanted to share some lessons learned around communication and what I would term like these 5 pillars of this type of communication during a crisis. So the first of these pillars is frequency. It's important to communicate often. Early on in our event, it was daily, and many times it would actually be a morning and an afternoon communication, particularly if I knew that the college's crisis management group, which was a group of high-level administrators, was meeting, and I knew the information was coming from them. Frequent communication goes a long way towards assuaging staff fears, and you can take away at least one element of uncertainty by letting staff know what the frequency of your communication will be. The second pillar is consistency. So once you kind of establish and make known the frequency, you need to be consistent about following that schedule. If you have to deviate from it, communicate about the communication, right? So tell people, I thought I was going to send you a communication by 3 o'clock today. It's actually not going to come until 5 o'clock, or I'm not going to have that information until tomorrow. You also need to think about the consistency of who the communication is coming from. So I would recommend that you establish at the most 2 people who are responsible for communication to your staff. So if information comes from a variety of sources, it can seem chaotic to people that information is kind of flooding in from all these different people. And it might end up being contradictory or seeming contradictory because people write in different ways, or people have, stronger or weaker communication skills in terms of sort of laying out steps and things like that. depending, yeah. So on writing style or clarity can be a huge help in disseminating information. So you want someone who has strong communication skills and who has sort of an established level of authority or trust with your staff, so that they'll have this baseline assumption that the communication is accurate and timely. The third point I want to make is around clarity. So as I'm going to say this probably too many times, but these events are disruptive to staff and they create situations and feelings that can make receiving and digesting information more difficult than normal. So you need to make sure that information is presented clearly and logically, particularly if there are steps that you need staff to take. You want to get it as right as you can the first time and avoid needing to send follow-up emails or clarifications. So be very intentional and thoughtful as you craft messages to your staff. Fourth is empathy. As we've said, these events are super disruptive. And when staff are cut off from emails and IMs and college phones, they can feel, because the truth of it is that they are, very cut off and isolated and unsure. What information are they missing? Is there something they were supposed to do that they didn't even know that they were supposed to do, and now they've missed something? There can be a lot of anxiety and questions and uncertainty that arise. And so you want to communicate from a place of empathy. You want to take some time in your communication to acknowledge where people might be in terms of their mind frame or even their emotional state, and be respectful of that, in the tone of your communication. And be clear that you understand the difficulties and thank people for what they are doing to help each other out, to help students out, to help colleagues out. And then, open the door for that return communication back so people can feel like, okay, I didn't quite understand what I'm supposed to do. I know I can ask though, if I feel like I didn't get everything. And finally, planning. I would encourage you to recognize that really good communication takes time and planning. Who is going to communicate when, how are decisions that you can plan for ahead of time. So you can have a communication plan in place that you simply slide right into in the case of one of these events. If you are the person who is tasked with communication, I want you to recognize that it's going to take a significant investment of your time and energy. You're getting the information from some other source. You are then taking and crafting that into a communication that's what people need to know, that's clear, that's logical, that's well laid out. And that's a significant investment of your time and energy, right? To get that together and to do it in the right way. And again, you want to do it timely, but don't rush. Rush and you make mistakes. And then you're back into that notion of, oh, I've got to clarify what I said because people didn't understand it.
So one of the things I think that surprised us, or certainly strikes us, is just how long it took to get things back on track. So as Cheryl mentioned, things happened on February 10th. Today is December 14th. It's been 10 months. So we wanted to kind of go through and kind of give you a status update of like how long it took to get things back, because I mean, it's not a pretty reality, but I do think it helps to kind of know, what things could look like. So printing was a big one. As Cheryl mentioned, we lost all printing on campus. Now, we did have some open hours at this point. We weren't completely back to our quote normal hours in terms of the pandemic at this point, but we did have open hours at all 6 of our 6 locations that have libraries. We didn't have any official printing on campus until August, the first day of the semester. Yes, they rolled it out, bugs and all, on the first day of the semester. First day of fall semester is always our busiest time, regardless, pandemic, no pandemic, cyber attack, no cyber attack. That's our busiest day of the year. And that is the first day it was back with charging fees. Now it was back, we have a system that charges money or takes it out of student print accounts. That was back, I believe, early August. the printing was back, but without fees. Now, the library did some things beforehand because we knew this was going to be a problem. We are one of the main places on all of our campuses where students come to print. We knew that it was going to take a while. We didn't necessarily know how long, but we knew it was going to take a while to print. We also knew that ITS had bigger fish to fry. Printing was not, it might have been one of the top things that we knew from the library standpoint we needed, but it wasn't one of the biggest things from a college standpoint that needed to be solved. So we actually created a workaround where we had a laptop that was not networked, that was tied to a printer that was not networked, that was a desktop printer, that students could at least come in and have somewhere on campus to print. We were the only place on campus where students could come to print things out. So that was something that we were able to kind of do as a workaround so that there was something, because we knew what the need was. First of all, we know it because in normal times, that's one of the biggest ways in which we're used is for printing. We also knew the questions we were getting in chat about, like, if I come in, can I print? So that is something we put in place temporarily so that there would be something there for students to come. We had to do it in such a way that we weren't charging. It wasn't the automated system, fancy system that the college normally has in place, but we did have something there. So that was one that took a very long time, and that's a pretty major component of the service that libraries come physically to our spaces to use. The college uses a lot of internal forms for things, and those are still not resolved. So we're 10 months out, that still has not been fixed. Just to give you an idea, these are things like rate sheets for part-time employees, travel forms, reimbursement forms for conference attendance, key request forms for new staff that you need to office change information, again, with leaving and new staff coming on. Those are all internal forms, and that is doesn't exist right now, basically. Our computers are locked down. We used to be able to do some simple things on our own. We're not able to do that now. You do have to go through the ITS help desk. They don't have a ticketing system for kind of the bigger things. For example, I remember Cheryl needing to add, just getting printer drivers for her desktop printer. That was something that instead of just being something that she could do, she had to go through the ITS help desk, which, as you might imagine, was fielding a very large backlog of calls. It was a very long wait time. So that was one that is still in place. In terms of, we still don't have access to certain things, and we still have to go through the ITS help desk system to get access. The wait times are not as long as they were during peak times. Timesheets are now, they're a manual process at the moment. So they used to be such that they kind of showed up on our intranet at a certain point in the month. Now we wait for someone at the college to send us the templates. And sometimes they come much later than normally we would have our deadline for getting them in so that they can be processed in time. So that is still not in place. That kind of ties in with those online internal forms farther up on that table, but timesheets are still such that they exist, but they're not kind of automatic. Someone at the college in HR is sending them as an all college email. Here's the templates for the timesheets. Google Suite, as Cheryl mentioned, we moved to Google Suite for our email and for other things. In the beginning, this was stated as kind of a temporary move until we knew what was going to happen. The college that promised that at some point they would make a decision between going back to Microsoft or staying on Google Suite. They did decide, I believe, at some time in August, the decision was made. There are some things that products we have, specifically SpringShare, don't sync well. There's a thing in Google Suite that has to get turned on that is not. They have it pretty locked down. We were told that if the college decided to stay with Google Suite, they would turn on some functionality for us. That has still not happened. So to give you an idea of what that means for us, practically speaking, I mentioned we use a lot of SpringShare products. We use LibStaffer to do our schedules for desk schedules, also chat, which is among staff from all 6 of our locations. We also use SpringShare products to schedule student appointments. So students who want one-on-one appointments can choose their campus, can choose what librarian they want to speak to. Those don't sync with our calendars right now. So the way it's supposed to work is the SpringShare would pull from our calendars, and that's how it worked in Outlook, and it could tell when you were busy, or if you had a desk shift, it would auto-populate in your calendar. That doesn't work, and they still haven't turned on the functionality for that, rendering some of those products a lot, in the case of LibStaffer with desk shifts, a lot less useful. In the case of student appointments, we're still able to use them, but it's a lot of workarounds on our end to be able to kind of get that so that students can make appointments when we are available and not when we're not available. So that's still ongoing. Guest access. This is a really big deal because we are really the only place on any of our campuses where people who are not members of the Central Piedmont community, so current faculty, staff, or students, can use a computer. So that means that obviously community users, but people who are trying to become students, we are where they can come. We are where they can look up the forms that they need for applications. We're where they can come to get the FAFSA forms. We're where they can come to get the other things they need to do to prove residency for the various state requirements. We are where people trying to become Central Piedmont students can do all that. We didn't have a possibility for guest access at all until maybe a month or so into our current semester. So I think it was sometime in late August, I believe. It still isn't fully, some of the functionality that we used to have, we still don't have. And for example, we had a way to do printing for those guests before. Now we basically don't. So they had to completely rebuild that software. And again, we're the only place on campus. So this matters because there isn't an alternative for people to use. Database access was one of the quicker things that was restored. We were single sign-on was restored mid-March, so just a little over a month from when we lost things, and that was 100% restored. As I mentioned previously, we kind of had some workarounds in place for a large number of our databases prior to that, but everything was restored by mid-March, so that was great. The college was keeping kind of a web page of updates from the technology interruption in terms of what's been updated from a college-wide perspective and things. It did announce that it was closing that website as of December 1st. So again, I want you to think about that. February 10th was when the attack happened. They are basically saying, okay, most things are restored and operational. We're closing this website that is specifically communication about what's back up and running after the attack. That's 9.5 months later. So that website has closed. I think somebody mentioned it earlier. They did just recently announce that they were no longer going to be updating that because they essentially said we're basically back to normal. Although you can see from our chart here, there are still things that are still not completely restored. So that kind of gives you a sense of how long things really take to kind of get back to some semblance of normal.
So we did want to just offer some conclusions and some information as we kind of wrap up our perspectives here today. So Emily gave me a great segue into recovery is going to take longer than you expect. It will take longer than you expect. I don't think any of us at the start of this thought 10 months later, we would still be dealing with these issues. But some of them were very long-term. You know, we talked about administrative rights to computers that we used to have at least some, and then that totally went away. And now we just learned today that they're talking about bringing some of that back. So you'll get to these really restrictive, like very security focused stances. And then, you know, as you work through, you know, your refined security measures post-attack, you might start to have conversations about what comes back and what doesn't. So these are very, very long-term conversations about all of the things that need to be recovered and how they might be recovered. Our second point is you're never going to know the details, right? There is this very human need in all of us to be like, who did this to us and what exactly happened, and explain it all to me. And the colleges couldn't provide that information. Even our president had a college-wide meeting and she just frankly said, there's some things I'm never going to be able to tell you. The FBI was involved in our investigation, you know, State Bureau of Investigation for North Carolina. It was a very serious, big investigation, and you want it as a human being, you want to know who did this to you, but you'll never know exactly what happened. you need to think about balancing your urgent needs with not wanting to overwhelm ITS, right? You're in a recovery phase, your IT department is stretched as thin as possible, and they're dealing with huge college-wide concerns. Can students register for classes? Can students pay for classes? Like, that's super important to the continued health of your college. So you need to think about, what do you really need from them? In order to just offer your basic, most important, essential operations and services, and figure out what can wait for later from them. With that in mind, our other piece of advice is to address technology issues in a timely manner. Don't put off addressing something, because if you had something that wasn't quite working right, and then an event like this happens, well, now you've got this whole other layer of, not only do I need to recover it, but it wasn't exactly working right already. So you just want to keep up with that kind of stuff and don't let it fall to the wayside. Be proactive and creative where you can. And printing is an example of this. As Emily mentioned, we know how important printing is to some of our student population. Being a community college, a lot of our students don't have access to technology any other place than on campus. And when they need to print something, they come to us and they rely on us. So we knew how important that was to our students who come into the library. So what we did was we took a laptop that we had as soon as we could get back on some kind of wireless system, and literally found a little desktop printer and connected them the old-fashioned way with some cords, and made that into a print station. Was it awkward and was it slow? Sure. But in a state where a student was just absolutely in a panic, like, I have to print this and there's no place for me to do it, we could at least get something printed for them. You also have to accept that some data is probably going to be lost forever. So as we mentioned, we used to have Outlook. We used to use Microsoft. We used to have Outlook as our email. And the three of us can sit here and tell you that we had these beautiful organized inboxes with folders. I had years of emails saved of where I had, asked a question and gotten an answer in writing that I wanted to preserve, or asked somebody, how do I do this thing? And they were like, okay, here's the 3 steps. And I just parked that over in my email, so that next time I needed to know how to do that, I went right back to that email and there were my 3 steps. It's gone. We got back 30 days of email and that was it. So the rest of that huge treasure trove of information that we had saved and organized is just simply gone forever. And really, maybe the last and the most sort of overarching conclusion that we have is that changes are inevitable, whether you're dealing with the aftermath of these kind of attacks or whether you're taking steps in preparation to deal with the potentiality of one of these. So for example, your passwords, how you manage passwords, how long they have to be, how often you change them, that's going to change. We went, it had been, I think, in the works for a little bit prior to the attack, but one of the main focuses after the attack became going to multi-factor authentication as a security measure. So there's another extra layer that everybody has to go through there. As Cheryl mentioned, can't put a USB in a computer on campus anymore. So you'll want to think about, again, how, if you have things that are on USBs, how you would switch to the cloud, how you kind of communicate that to your students, how you sort of make sure nobody is doing that. And understand that technology might become a lot more locked down and that you won't be able to do everything that you used to. Like we used to have administrative rights where we could download printer drivers and some things related to library software that we needed to do frequently, that we wouldn't have to get somebody in ITS to come over and do that. We were sort of trusted to do that ourselves. And a lot of that, has just, it's just disappeared. There might be some limited administrative rights coming back, but it's certainly not going to be the way that it was before. So either in preparation or dealing with an aftermath, just understand that your relationship with the technology and how you use it and kind of what happens on campus and who gets to do stuff is probably going to change. So that's the end of our experiences and our best pieces of advice. This is our contact information. So of course, anybody can feel free to reach out to any of us, all of us, if you have particular questions that you want to ask. But I think for now, we'll just open it up to any Q&A or questions or comments that y'all might have.
Thank you guys so much for doing this great presentation. As I said, folks, please, if you do have any questions, please put them in the questions, ask and answer, or if you just want to chat them, that's also fine. I can ask them to our panelists. We don't have any at the moment, so I'm going to give folks a little bit of time to chat if you guys have any. And I'm actually going to ask a question for you all because I have one. So if we don't have anyone else, I will ask one. And my question is, so you mentioned like the importance, of you talking about LibShare and the fact that it was located off campus and it was externally hosted. My question is, when balancing what your guys' thoughts are and what maybe Carol and Piedmont's thoughts are about the balance between keeping things in the cloud, which does have other types of security issues. I think everyone probably saw the Log4 things happening recently.
Yes.
And that kind of local thing, which does really open you up to ransomware. Kind of like, how do we do that kind of a balance? I don't know if anyone can answer this, but it's just kind of a thought I'm thinking, like, how do we do that balance between those two site types of systems that both have their own types of insecurities and vulnerabilities?
Yeah, it's probably just like redundancy and backups, right? You have to, and one of the things I didn't mention that I thought about earlier was like keeping print things not in your office. Like the days after the ransomware attack, we were not allowed back on campus. Like you could not physically set foot on a campus. If you did get specific permission to set foot on a campus, your Bluetooth, like anything that would connect to a network, don't bring it, turn it off. So having a print copy of stuff at some other, like your house or some other location would be, so it's just like this idea of redundancy, right? I might have it in the cloud, I might have it someplace else, I might keep copies and just kind of plan for that. If one goes down, I have essential stuff, someplace else. A lot of institutions are using business continuity software. That's like, that's again, it's in another place so that you can access this type of information as well too.
And Kate, just to piggyback, sorry, Emily.
That's okay.
To piggyback off that, that's where we found most of our issues. If the software was hosted internally and we didn't have such redundant backups or extra security that we could retrieve past data, for security purposes, they would rather lose the data than open it back up and risk reinfecting the college. So for some extent, some of those externally hosted things were better for us because they were responsible for that. So they found out about this ransomware attack, and within a half hour or so, they started shutting down systems at Central Piedmont. So it didn't get far, which is really the important thing. It never got to anybody's personal data, it never got to social security numbers, none of that was ever compromised, fortunately. And so some of the larger software companies, like being with a SpringShare product, protected our chat because they never got there. And so since it was externally hosted, it wasn't impacted when they turned everything off internally, even just from a safety perspective.
And what I was going to say was just piggybacking off of what Jennifer said in terms of keeping printed things. We're not talking about everything. We're not saying you have to be at the point where you have, like the early days of computers where you had printouts of everything that you also had on your computer just in case. We're just talking like, what would you really and truly be just completely devastated or not able to do what you need to do if you didn't have? cell phone numbers, contact informations for vendors. What are the 1 or 2 things that you do that if you needed, what information do you need that maybe you can keep a copy of? We're not talking about files and files and files that you're keeping at home and not having separation between the two. That's not what we mean. What we mean is, do think about, if the worst were to happen, what are those 2 or 3 things you really wish that you had with you, and have hard copies of those somewhere else.
I will also say some of the behavior that changed for me personally is I was one of those that logged off every day, logged out of every program and that was it when I left for the day. Restart the computer in the morning, right? I don't do that anymore because I was on my laptop at home, and because I was the same as my personal laptop, I never really logged out of half the software. It just ran in the background. And because of that, I was able to access some of my files and programs. I never lost access, or I lost access just for a blip as they were rebooting them. So I will say now I just tend to I just lock my computer at the end of the day, and about once a week I reboot. And it's weird things like that I never would have really thought of, because I like to shut everything down so we can all, reboot in the morning, start fresh so you don't have memory issues and things. But if you can, try not to. I mean, because that's really what saved us. Those of us who were still able to be on WebEx were those of us who did not log off the day before, who just minimized the software, and the messaging basically stopped at the end of business, so it wasn't a big deal. But that way we never got lost in that software, and our access remained, which helped.
Awesome. Well, we haven't gotten any questions, so I'm glad I got mine in and gave you guys a question, and we are pretty much right at time. So I want to thank you all once again for presenting. Thanks so much to Emily and Jennifer and Cheryl. As I said to other folks at the beginning, we will be sending this recording out to you all so you can share this with others. And then in 6 months, we will be posting this on our YouTube channel for free. So at that point, feel free to share broadly and widely, as I said, because I feel like this is really incredibly important. Carolina Piedmont had a hard hit, but you're certainly not the only ones who have had hard hits. And unfortunately, I think it's probably going to be a reality for libraries in the future. So thank you all so much, and have a great rest of your Tuesday. I'm going to stop recording.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Bye.